And really the past 2 days are testament to the excellent research being done in this area. But as we get ready to leave this conference, I want to remind you of something that Andres said to us yesterday, which was picked up by Ron at the President's dinner. And that alongside the environmental crisis, can there be a more important focus for regional research than rising inequalities and the people and places that are left, or as Ron put it last night, kept behind? Well, focus is one thing. Change requires solutions, or perhaps more realistically, we could call it actions. Put simply, what could or should we be doing as regional researchers and a regional research community? It's in that spirit that the aim of this closing panel is to facilitate a discussion and stimulate debate around whether existing policies and frameworks help or hinder cities and regions, and make the question of whether there are alternatives that we should be promoting. Now, I'm absolutely delighted to say we have 4 panellists to start this conversation. And normally when you commit to organising one of these panels, you come up with your list of the people you'd like to invite, your dream team of a lineup of presenters to cover the kind of topics that you want to cover. And the reality is that 99% of the time you don't always get the lineup that you want. Well, this time I'm delighted to say we have got the dream team. The 4 people that are on the stage this afternoon are the 4 people that we identified and invited. And I think within the space of 12 hours we had 4 acceptances, which is completely unheard of, I think. Hopefully that's a testament that they want to be here, they're not here under duress. I really want to say thank you to all 4 of them for taking up the invitation to come and provide some kind of opening provocations. So the way the session is designed to run is that each of our 4 panellists is going to speak for 10 minutes and provide a kind of opening position statement from their perspective. So in the first instance, it's a great pleasure to welcome and invite forward Gillian, Bristow and Cecilia Wong, who are both from the UK 2070 Commission, looking at kind of inequalities in cities and regions. So as well as being kind of renowned academics, renowned researchers, they've got a very active role at the moment in shaping some of the discussions and debates as to where we go forward in the UK. Then we have Louis Dijkstra, also known as of about 3 hours ago as the gentleman in pink from the European Commission, and Marcin Dąbrowski from Delft University, who's been involved in numerous European funded projects lately, exploring a whole multitude of different issues. So after their initial kind of provocation, which should take the first half of this session, the idea then is to open the floor for plenty of questions and dialogue, and get your input, and hopefully we can finish the conference with a constructive and lively discussion. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Gillian, who's going to be the first presenter.
For the invitation to be here today. It feels like coming home, coming to an RSA conference, which is really, really nice. So as part of the invitation then to be part of this panel, as John said, I'm going to speak a little bit about the work of the UK 2070 Commission. So that's really going to be the basis for my provocation, if you like. And I'm part of this commission along with Cecilia and Phil, McCann and others who are part of the RSA community. And I'll say a few words about what the Commission is, what it's trying to achieve, and I'll probably focus essentially on some of the critical and thorny governance challenges that it's confronting. And I'll particularly pick up issues around devolution and asymmetries of power that the Commission is looking at before handing over to Cecilia, who will talk through some of the other issues that she's particularly been focusing upon. Okay, so the Commission's brief and purpose is as on the slide. What it's essentially trying to do then is focus on city and regional inequalities in the UK. So it's an independent inquiry chaired by Lord Bob Kerslake, and it's been set up to conduct a review of the policy and spatial issues related to the UK's long-term city and regional development. Commissioners are drawn from a wide range of sectors, so public sector, private sector, representatives from a number of different countries, policy think tanks, and as well as academics, of course, from UK universities. So quite a wide-ranging commission. The reference to 2070 is specific, and it seems like a long way away, but it's an explicit recognition, I think, that the timescales for successful city and regional development are often very long, in contrast to the short-termism of political cycles. So it's very much an ambition for long-termism in regional development thinking. So far, the Commission's published 2 reports. It's undertaken widespread consultation and a number of events, and it's due to publish the 3rd report and final report early in 2020. So say a little bit more about the focus of the Commission and what the problem is that it's seeking to address. So it's essentially focusing, as I said, really on the central concern that the UK is still deeply imbalanced interregionally. And it's recognising really that state of affairs has worsened significantly over the last 4 decades, and that the expectation is that regional and spatial disparities are likely to widen further into the future. So it's very much recognising that you've got the graph there, the Cambridge econometrics data showing the sort of picture of the widening north-south divide in very general terms, and an expectation that some of our weakest regional and local economies in the UK are likely to be the least resilient to further economic shocks and change. Now, the Commission recognises that this is, of course, a very long-standing and very familiar problem, but what it's sought to do is really bring together the really rich evidence and rich analysis that exists on the issue and the scale and nature of the challenge. What I think it's also been really keen to do is to put the argument forward for much more drastic, transformative policy action, saying really that drastic and significant action is needed more than ever really for a number of reasons. First reason really is that it recognises that existing policy approaches to this problem have failed. As Lord Kerslake himself has put it, most policy responses to spatial inequalities in the UK to date have been like pea shooters or sticking plasters. So in other words, they've been too small, too short-lived, and too disjointed to have and make a lasting impact. Secondly, the Commission has also been keen to emphasise that no one wins from the current imbalances that exist. So households and businesses in poorer areas of the UK have worse economic and health and social outcomes, whilst more prosperous areas suffer the consequences of higher living costs and the disbenefits associated with things like congestion and longer commuting. So inequality, it's arguing, acts as a brake on better outcomes for all across the UK. But thirdly, the Commission is also arguing that increasingly there's a significant environmental price being paid by us all as we place growing pressure on our land and natural resources. So particularly in the second and most recent report, the Commission has been keen to emphasise that the current pattern of development in the UK is not sustainable, and that tackling the emergency associated with climate change and spatial inequalities across the UK are inextricably linked. And I think that's an important theme that's increasingly emerging. So what's the Commission focusing on and proposing to do? Well, I've highlighted here the key actions that are identified in the second report called Moving Up the Gears. And in this report, the Commission has identified 7 national priorities for action to avoid worsening performance and widening divisions between different parts of the UK. And that might be a test of your eyesight as to whether you can read all of those. But in essence, the recommendations embrace the range of different actions needed in terms of both governance and institutional challenges, land use, spatial planning, infrastructure and so on. So there are a raft of different recommendations that are being put forward for action, which include significant governance and institutional reforms that it says are needed to tackle spatial inequalities. I wanted to just also perhaps pick up one of the key themes as well that the Commission is focusing on, and one of the recommended actions is to strengthen the foundations of local economies, and an increasing emphasis then is being put upon support for the foundational economy in the UK. And the foundational economy then, as many of you will know, is referring to sort of economy that captures the basic requirements of civilised life for all citizens, irrespective of their income and location. It includes then material infrastructure, so pipes and cables, utility distribution systems for water and electricity and so on, as well as providential services, so education, health, elderly care, income maintenance and so on. And these are activities then which are neither easily tradable nor exportable and provide those sort of basic goods and services upon which citizens rely and which keep us safe, sound and civilised. And so the Commission has been keen to build up an emphasis upon strengthening the foundational economy in many local economies, seeing these then as activities which focus on intrinsically significant goals and supporting the infrastructure of everyday life. And I think the inclusion of this thinking in the Commission's work really represents quite a significant acknowledgement that regional policy needs to be broadened, that if it's to tackle these inequalities, it needs to capture and be more socio-economic in orientation and not just economic in orientation. So there's certainly a trend towards emphasising the capacities of places to develop in a manner which is better attuned to local needs and circumstances, and also I think to develop more experimentation in governance and policy to tackle some of these issues. Now I said I was going to focus upon issues of governance in particular that the Commission is highlighting, and of course this inevitably requires looking at issues around the new configurations of power and economic relationships emerging with the devolved administrations, with the city deals that exist across the UK, with powerhouses, with city regions and so on. So there's lots of issues there around exploring the resources and powers of the devolved administrations and other authorities, and in particular how well those arrangements match the needs of the UK's different local economies. It also, I think, means examining relationships between places and how well the institutional architecture knits together in support of the wider collective interest. I think the computer's just frozen, sorry. But the final, if I can just say a little bit about the governance challenges. In short, the Commission has highlighted two key governance challenges that it's, I think, raise a whole set of other questions and things that we may wish to debate today. The first of these is accelerated devolution. So the Commission is arguing that the devolution arrangements for UK cities and regions need to be accelerated and extended in a number of ways. So firstly, devolution needs to be less asymmetric. It's arguing that rather than treating places unequally as it does at present, which is a recipe for fueling further inequality, devolution needs to be comprehensive and cover all areas, all parts of the UK. Secondly, it's also arguing for devolution which allows for much more localised discretion to meet local circumstances. So, for example, greater block funding to devolved authorities with enhanced power and resources to meet localised needs. It's recommending also that devolution needs accelerated change at central government level, that in fact there should be the introduction of, for example, parliamentary committees or cabinet positions which recognise, support and respond to the devolved bodies in each area. And finally, it's also arguing that the devolved bodies need to have much greater citizen engagement so that devolution actually builds and supports capacity to solve problems locally and build that sort of shared sense of identity that's so critical to success. And as well as accelerated devolution and a comprehensive framework for devolution, the sort of second key governance challenge that the Commission is focusing on is the need for coordinated national spatial planning frameworks. And our key element of the Commission's argument has been to emphasise that there needs to be a spatial plan for England, as currently England doesn't have a spatial plan. But it also argues that the spatial plans of the devolved administrations then need to connect up with that spatial plan for England, so that development is much more connected and coordinated across the whole of the UK. Now, I'm sure there are an awful lot of issues there that we could debate and discuss further. We've got clearly need to move on. But the Commission's work, I think, is at least starting to gain some traction. It's certainly attracting, I think, and creating a lot of debate and interest. There are all sorts of questions about the details of these initiatives of development and indeed how they will be, if they will be taken up. But certainly I think it's starting to provoke a really interesting conversation, and I hope we can carry that conversation on this afternoon. Thank you.
Jill's talk, talking about what I do in it. The Commission, really one mission we're trying to do is make the government think spatially. And that is what regional studies here. For a long time we pushed for that. At that time, we remember they've done a UK industrial strategy inquiry, and the outcome is spatial. We know that we have a strategy on the UK. And then I started thinking about 2070, the UK space industrial strategy was dated. Really, we look for the fourth industrial revolution, so Industrial 4.0. So what does it look like in the turbulent time? It's quite interesting. Klaus Schwab from he's the chief, I think, executive chairman of the World Economic Forum. And in his book, he actually particularly talked about digital technology knows no border. And more importantly, say the geography impact of technology we need to know, but also the impact of geography on technology. So the space dimension is very strongly articulate. And he is also very critical of many decision makers. They tend to think very linear traditionally, and they're too absorbed with something of the crisis, and they don't think strategically. And if we think about 50 years later, we do need to think, what else? Greg Clark, our Secretary of State in BEIS, he actually been quite critical lately about geography, about local and regional boundaries, saying that the lab and the combined authority may not be reflect the functional geography. That might be the case, but actually, if we look at the lab and the related combined authority, the geography is very complex, and especially in West Midlands, I can't get my head over the complex relationship. If I can't get my head around it, I'm sure the England Investor and other people can't. Regional Studies Association also very helpful, actually, particularly make this point, that people don't respect administrative boundary. They carry on going to what they work, and the pollution definitely don't reflect where the boundary is. So all this show that actually it's very important for us to think spatially, especially meaningful space. But here I need to apologize, all my maps are largely done at local authority district level because I can't get lower level spatial data to do better. But hopefully that gives us a picture about where we are now and where we want to be in 50 years' time. So look at existing geography. That side, you can see the green is showing us have higher level than the national average in terms of business. And the hash area is with large business. As we can see, it's more or less London, M4 corridor, M62 corridor, the central belt of London, plus some other metropolitan area. Interestingly, if you control by the number of population, the relationship gone. More or less the Shire area doing much better, except London, going out to the M4 corridor. So that is the absolute size term, but also the relative performance. And then this one, we're looking at, if we talk about Industrial 4.0, what's the manufacturing distribution look like? As we can see in that side of the graph, London basically, our most successful area, don't do manufacturing anymore. It's really a big go-to M4 corridor to Swindon and that side. And the M62 corridor for Liverpool, Manchester, along there, do more. And then it's a bit of the north. But of course, in the future, it's not about manufacturing. It's about the linking of the platform to other service industry and information and communication and the strong. At the basic at the cliff edge. Outside London, you find that, and then go to the corridor, and then the other places, there's not much going on. We can see a bit in Cheshire, in Manchester, Leeds, again, Edinburgh, and Glasgow in Scotland. Oops, sorry. Technology is not. Okay, that's fine. So this one is looking at professional, scientific, and technical sector again, similar to the previous one. As we can see, London again with the M4 corridor, and then bits and pieces around the major metropolitan area. So if you overlay the free sector, then we can see the dark brown is they're performing well on all three. The orange, they're okay on all three, but the others not. So you can see actually very catchy. If that is our future of industrial strategy, that is showing us that it is actually quite not very optimistic if you look at that picture. London is quite interesting, as you say, there is no manufacturing sector. So it's really strong on the surface. So again, we start thinking about different role of different city. That may be the argument of Manchester as well. Actually, Cheshire is much stronger in manufacturing in that sense. So then we look at the labour market condition. The McKinsey Global Institute's report is really good to point out that it's all about quality. So in the future, we'll shift to look at people that are more good social emotional skills, advanced cognitive capability, have logical reasoning and creativity. So how do we fare currently? That one is showing the job density, where we have a more number of jobs than the number of people, economic active people. Again, very patchy, as we can see the map there. And this one, looking at the pay, is very much a north-south divide. If you have the Seven and Wash line, that is very clear. That's a differential. And then the number of economic active population, again, mainly concentrated in the southeast, maybe some of the larger metropolitan area. And this one, look at unemployment, is very interesting. London actually come out quite badly recently, lately. So southeast is doing quite well, but London is not. And then the north is pretty terrible. And then we look at the population drive or population change. Again, it's more a north-south divide, the Seven Wash line. Towards southeast and London is doing much better of future population growth. But when we move to the north, it's actually declining. So again, if you talk about, you have industry, where's the workforce, where's the quality workforce? And this is look at education qualification, again, north-south divide, except Scotland have a much better education system, so that is coming out in the map. Then we look at commuting, how you connect where people live and where people work. It's quite interesting. That is the overall pattern, because different part of the UK use different data, so that's why you have this really odd map, because some places not as detailed as England. And the one on that top left-hand corner is an all commuting pattern. You can see London is actually quite exciting in the morning. It's just like the radio and the star with the other smaller area. That one is blue collar. Blue collar workers don't travel that fast, very localized. That one is high flyer. We can start seeing different places connecting up. And that one is the final one. Is look at tech and city type. The London dominance also come out. I call the high-speed rail 2. You can see London, Birmingham, Leeds, and Manchester. So it's a high-speed rail 2 map of the commuting. So if we actually build a high-speed rail 2, what for? Is it for these people even commute it easier? So we haven't really worked out what we're doing it for. And if we go into, oh, sorry. To look at the driver of economic productivity, especially looking at R&D expenditure. Currently, the EU 28 is having, I think the ratio is 1.79, and UK is 1.69. And they wanted to achieve 3% in 2020. So it's a long way for us to meet the EU target. But we Brexit already by that time, so don't worry. And here, it's quite interesting, the argument about the private sector and the government. The R&D expenditure was shocked me when I look at it. Okay, you expected the Golden Triangle will take up nearly half of the R&D expenditure there. But it is the pink. The pink is interesting. Look at London. The private sector only invests about half. The other, all public sector money into higher education, into government investment. But if you look at Northwest, comment. And I reworked his data with the latest, and that comment stands. And then we also mapped our ref, we're going to have next ref. So we have the Mickey Mouse, is the ref, you can recognize which university. And that mapped into the life science companies. Just in the Golden Triangle, 2,000 life science companies. They closely link with the research capacity, but also link to the R&D expenditure. If that trend carry on, you can project in 50 years' time what happened. I don't want to talk more about airport, we all know about it, and port facilities, same. Now just look at the expenditure. So basically in London, average you'll get about £4,300 per head by the government to invest in infrastructure. If you go to live in West Midland, you get £400. And these are also very shocking. Look at broadband. If the future is about digital, about data science, about AI, we can look at now super fast broadband. We expected it. Ultra fast is more. We at least expecting to coming. We can see in Wales and Northern Ireland, especially they need it more because they're more rural, and the coverage is quite weak. But more interesting is look at the government spending. 75% spent in England, 40% Scotland, 9% in Wales, 1.6% in Northern Ireland. And look at the leverage ratio with other money. If the government spends £1 in Wales, then you get £2.34 from somewhere else. And same as for Scotland, 1.82, 1.92, and England is the worst one, 1 to 4p more from the private sector. And that is the split between Scotland and the Whitehall about why the coverage. So it's quite interesting. So I actually done that two map in the report, especially this one. We can tell how dominant the capacity of the broadband, especially the quality one, is actually concentrated in London, and then also in the bigger urban area. The National Infrastructure Commission actually read the report, and they actually called me. They were surprised that I can do that map. And then they actually talked to me, okay, maybe the next infrastructure assessment, they will need to look at the spatial dimension, because actually it's quite critical. So to conclude, the Industrial 4.0 in the report, what do we find? It's actually a very differential spatial landscape. And we can see that different spatial industrial specialization and spatial restructuring over the last few decades, and that result in very different pattern and variations. And no doubt the London and South East is a super agglomerative cluster, really dominate the whole driver of the whole country's economy. But we also saw that London's success is not purely by the market. It's actually, there's a lot of effects and path dependency of how the Whitehall decide to spend the money. And there's a lot of rhetoric about functional economic areas. But when we look at the spatial agglomeration, we find that actually a lot of times the agglomerative forces is much bigger than even currently. If you look at the Greater Manchester Combined Authority or other geography. And I think we are facing serious global challenge, but the UK seems to resort to local strategy and a spatial strategy to deal with the gravity of this challenge. So, if we carry on what we are, what does the spatial strategy or the cluster will look like? It will look like that, more or less, not much difference. But if you look at up to these two areas, they all have river there, frontage. And you look at this, London is getting to the really breaking, exploding. Because the green belt, because of the national park, we face very contentious issue that if we keep putting economic growth in those areas, with the population and where is the housing and how we deal with the green infrastructure. So just in time, thank you.
Well, thank you for sticking around. My pleasure to give you a short kickoff. I'll try to be provocative. Usually I do a very map-filled presentation, lots of European maps, but today I decided to just give a short talk, 10 minutes, a couple of ideas, a couple of suggestions. Start with a traditional disclaimer. Please don't think what I say is the opinion of the European Commission, but it's just my private opinion. I want to start with describing a little bit the context, and I think lots of you have heard it already today, and I want to start with 4 Ds. When I started to work at the European Commission in early 2000, we were reducing regional disparities, and we felt like we were just helping the market along, which was also reducing disparities. We had a decade of convergence. We were confident we were going for another couple of decades of convergence. Fast forward to today, we've already had 10 years of either zero convergence between regions or even divergence. So that's our first D. Then if we look at discontent, Andres presented a new paper on that, which I've been helping with, and we've done a previous paper on that. Discontent is rising. It's having a clear political impact. My mother's country, the UK, may actually leave the Union in part because of that discontent. So that's definitely something we need to grapple with and we need to better understand. Disinvestment. Again, Mia Gray did a brilliant presentation on showing how much the investment, public investment, has been reduced, where it has been reduced, and the dire consequences of those changes. And then the last D is distrust. The financial crisis eroded trust in the European Union, eroded trust in national government, and contributed what we can call project fear. Tell people that the future is going to be horrible, that migrants are going to take over the country, that Muslims are going to take over the country, and that we'll all be far worse off. Now, that's a bit of a bleak picture, right? That's no fun. So I thought, let's try and come up with a more positive story. How can we look at these issues and how can we address them? I think we clearly need a positive discourse. And I think Andres started with that already, showing that public investment can help. It can mitigate problems. It can improve quality of life. It can increase trust and improve, provide access to services. So I think that's an important point. But one of the things I actually am critical of, even of my own employer, is that we tend to focus on the past. But look, we've paid for this. Yeah, but they're still worried. Why should something that you've done in the past be something that would fix the future? And I think also we as a discipline tend to focus on data that covers the past. And I think we need to be talking about the future. How can we make the future attractive? And maybe we need to make the future attractive again, because it used to be that you thought the future would be better. Your kids were going to have a better life. Your community was going to be a better place. Why don't we believe that anymore? And how can we change that? So I think that's the key project. And for me, unless the EU manages to tell a positive, convincing, attractive story about how we're going to improve the future, we're going to fail. And we're already losing one member state, and I don't want to lose more. The other 2 points I want to make, and actually touches very much on Gillian's presentation, is about voice and about agency. I'm convinced that a lot of discontent is people feel their voice doesn't count. Whatever they want to say, there is nobody there to hear it, and they can't express themselves in a way that has an impact. We have social media, where of course lots of people are expressing themselves, or rather, a lot of organizations are expressing themselves, either maybe with pernicious intentions or not, but that's not voice. That's not getting your voice heard. We need to find a different channel to make sure that happens. And the last bit is about agency. You want to have the impression that you can change your life, life of your children, your surroundings. You can make a positive impact. How do we give that sense of agency? To use another horrible slogan, how do we give them control? How do they take back control? And I think unless we have a clear answer to that, I think we're going to struggle and we're going to see turbulent times continue. Now, I have a few practical proposals, and the first one is really going more to political science. How do we convince people that their voice is heard, that their vote matters? Well, first of all, we do that by changing an electoral system. We have seen changes which reduces the impact of people's votes, notably in the US with gerrymandering and restrictions on voter registrations, but also in the UK. We have a first past the post system, which actually means that in many locations, your vote actually won't matter, and you don't have to vote. So I'm not saying we need to go to a direct democracy or that referendums are the answer, but I do think we need to acknowledge that a lot of people feel very frustrated with their options when they go to the next elections, including the one coming up in December. Now, we're not going to fix that right away, but I do think we need to think about this. How do we convince people that elections allow a voice in the future of their country or of the European Union? The other one touches on devolution. Of course, regional studies, we're fans of regions. We think they matter, we think places matter, but we need to give them a say. We need to give them more power. We need to give them the opportunity to respond what their voters, what their constituency, what their residents want. And without power and without funding, they can't do it. The fact that the UK is still one of the most centralized countries in the Union doesn't come as a surprise when we see at the level of discontent. And it's exactly that level of centralization that allows them to disproportionately hit certain parts of the country with reductions in investment, and you saw the figures just now. That gets me onto the point about public investment. With the EU, we do try and provide a stable 7-year source of investment, particularly for less developed regions, but also for transition regions and more developed regions. But that's nowhere near enough. We can't take over the job of a national government in providing public investment. We're a little icing on the cake. If there's no cake, you can't live off the icing. So really, the need to up public investment is critical, and to demonstrate that it's not only geared towards firms, but also geared to providing citizens with the services they need is critical. And the last point I want to make is on public engagement. How do we make sure that we engage with people in a constructive manner? And I think for me, the difference between the UK referendum and the Irish referendum is critical. The UK referendum basically didn't know what the other choice was. They knew what Remain meant. They had no idea what Leave meant. 3 years later, we still don't know what Leave means. The Irish referendum was prepared solidly by a group of randomly selected individuals who debated, got information, and sought out the consensus. And that process was lauded, that was applauded. And I find that a very exciting new way of trying to ensure that you create engagement. Not just a flick of a switch, not one or checks box or the other, but informed debate, in person, not on social media, but regularly, and having a convergence of opinions, seeking out a consensus. For me, that's clearly the way forward. Now, that's very challenging. Doing this at multiple scales is not easy. But I think the local scale, the regional scale, is one of the first places to start. And acknowledging that that is how we rebuild trust, we rebuild lives, and we rebuild places is my final message for you. Thank you.
Hello everyone. Thank you very much for having me here. I'm very honored to be part of this plenary panel, so thanks for inviting me. And I will take you to a different topic, something quite different, and something that is also not very glamorous, but in a very different way than Brexit and discontent. And that is the topic of circular economy. Which I will try to, in this short presentation, I will try to put a little bit on the radar of regional studies scholars, because I think at present it goes under the radar, which is a shame. And I'll try to make a case for that in a few points. So, just beginning about what is the nature of the problem, why circular economy matters. When you look at the resources that we are using as society globally, a lot of those resources are being used and then are not being used again, not being recycled. And the biggest sectors when it comes to the use of resources, extracted resources, are those three sectors here: housing and infrastructure, nutrition, so production of food, and mobility. And all three of those, I would reckon, have a very clear link to space, to cities, to regions, and therefore are at the very heart of our interest in regional studies. But as I said, unfortunately, a lot of the resources extracted today are not being then used again, are being used once and then discarded. And globally, one can talk of a circularity gap. And the gap is that only 9% of globally extracted resources are being cycled, that is, being reused, recycled, or refurbished. Therefore, we need to think more about circular economy and closing those material loops. And circular economy has been gaining ground in the past few years, has become an increasingly important topic in policies at various levels. And the idea behind that, I'm sure you've heard about this, so I don't have to explain it in detail. But the idea is to shift away from the linear economy, where materials are extracted, then used to produce goods, and then therefore value is added, and therefore after it's being used by the consumer, its value is being destroyed and the materials are being wasted, towards a system where materials circulate, where their value is being kept, or ideally also improved. So value is being created by processes of refurbishment, remanufacturing, and so on. So there's those different R strategies: reuse, repair, refurbish, manufacture, recycle, recover, and so on. So the question I would like to ponder with you is what are the implications of this for our cities and regions? And what is the current state of play when it comes to the transition towards circular economy? It's a good place to start, I guess. So we've seen in the recent years, and I'm sure also you've heard about at least some of those innovations, but we've seen an explosion of new kinds of products, processes, also governance processes that build on the idea of circular economy. To give you just some examples, things like producing stuff, manufacturing stuff, products from waste, like, for example, leather made out of fruit, bricks made out of mycelium, 3D printed benches, for example, made out of PET bottles, and also innovative governance processes like living labs to support circular economy, or ideas such as urban mining, so looking at the city as a potential mine of resources like copper, building material, and so on. So there's really a flurry of innovations there. At the same time, it's becoming an important point on the policy agenda at all scales. So looking at Europe, circular economy has been gaining ground in the last few years to become one of the priorities of the EU in its efforts to reduce emissions. At the national level, we see also a proliferation of policies trying to enable this transition towards circular economy. So you got here some examples from the Netherlands, for example, or Belgium, Scotland. But at the same time, we also see emergence of many policies at the subnational level in regions and cities across Europe and other parts of the world as well. So, and already a lot of the jobs, a lot of the economy in Europe is circular. In the recent report from Aspen, Dijkstra, we can see, for example, that already 4% of jobs in Europe corresponds to what one may call circular economy, technology providers, and nearly 1 million jobs in Europe relate to circular business models already. But there are some caveats. One of them is that, as one may expect, that there's uneven advancement towards circular economy across territories in Europe. And more importantly, and then here making a link perhaps with the presentation of Cecilia, a lot of the circular economy policies remain spatially blind. So the focus is on connecting various industries and flows of materials between them. So thinking about industrial symbiosis, so how we can use the waste of one industry as a resource for another. but the spatial dimension is often missing. So this is, for example, taken from circular strategy for Glasgow. So there's hardly any thinking about the spatial implantation of those innovations and those strategies for boosting circular economy. So this is what we think needs changing. And by we, I say me and my colleagues from Delft and other universities involved in a project on which I would like to build and show some findings from. And the project is called REPAIR, Resource Management in Peri-Urban Areas, going beyond urban metabolism. And I don't have time to go into detail, but in a nutshell, we are working with 6 urban regions across Europe. And we are trying to advance and develop strategies and solutions for promoting circular economy. And those strategies and solutions are meant to be spatial and sort of embedded in the territory. And we work with the living labs in those six regions. So the idea in our project is to really try to connect resource management, resource flows with spatial development. So add flows of materials to land and to people, and also social activities. So as I said, we try to develop solutions, coming up with these solutions for circular economy and strategies. I won't dwell on those because of lack of time here in this very short presentation. But a few challenges and opportunities and a provocation at the end. So there are 4 issues I would like to stress in terms of implications and those challenges for regional studies and for regions and cities. One of them relates to, well, regional economic geography. As when you think about circular economy and circular processes, well, they clearly benefit from industrial clusters that are already in place because of this industrial symbiosis that I mentioned. They benefit from presence of knowledge hubs because of the networks and the knowledge development, the design innovation that is needed. And agglomeration as well, because of the importance of waste flows in those agglomerations. And circular economy also remains tied to manufacturing. And therefore, one of the questions that arises is, like, could this be used also as an opportunity, as a potential for declining areas where industries have been declining, to reinvigorate those industries? Then the second point is that of a discourse on globally connected city regions with global flows of knowledge, knowledge economy, versus the need to really rethink regional economies through material flows that need to be localized or regionalized at least to, for example, cut emissions from transportation of materials, foster regional circular clusters and so on. And then there's the notion also of implications for relational geography, because when you look at the city and the region from a metabolic perspective, from perspective of material flows, then you see now new kinds of linkages and flows between territories, which invite a redefinition of the boundaries of the city. So I'll show you some maps from REPAIR to illustrate those points. This is a map showing Amsterdam metropolitan area. Unfortunately, in the slide, the background is not very visible. It's black, but it shows Amsterdam region, and it shows the flows of food waste in 2016. So what you can see here is there's a clear cluster of activity happening in the port of Amsterdam, which is still an industrial area of the city, where a lot of those circular activities concentrate. But also you see some more problematic things like flows of food waste going as far as Germany on the right-hand side. We did similar mapping of flows for construction and demolition waste, which, as you remember, is the #1 sort of sector in terms of hunger for resources. And here as well, we can see this spatial concentration of activities related to construction and demolition waste processing in the port of Amsterdam, and linkages stretching far beyond the city of Amsterdam into the region and also even the neighboring regions and countries. Then the second point that I wanted to make is that also relating to regional futures and urban futures is that there's a lot of potential for new kinds of jobs, or rethinking all kinds of jobs with circular economy, as there are those kind of core jobs related to those processes related to refurbishing, remanufacturing, processing waste, and also enabling jobs related to design and knowledge development and innovation. So there's new skills and old skills that are played, high skills and basic skills, And those are spatially clustered as well, as you can see here on those maps showing the Amsterdam city and an Amsterdam region on top. Then there's the question of land use as well. As circular economy, there's a lot of planning for circular economy now, thinking about development of circular districts. Like for example, here you can see image from plans for the harbor area in Amsterdam that is meant to be converted into more residential and commercial area with 40,000 to 70,000 houses planned for the coming few decades. But at the same time, as I showed you with those maps of flows, the harbor is the very heart of circular processes in the Amsterdam region. Therefore, this is likely to push out those activities if we develop so many houses in there. So the problem is the ignoring of externalities that circular processes imply. Noise, smells, you need a lot of space for that, for those activities. And that adds to those challenges and adds to the pressure on that. There's also interesting implications for peri-urban areas, which are ideal locations for those circular processes that require space and have those negative externalities. Unlike the city centers, which are more suitable for kind of knowledge-based economy activities and not very much for circular activities. So the urban expansion undermines that potential as well. And then the final point I wanted to make is about governance. And just very quickly on this, I will not insist too much, but it is a wicked problem as well, like often is the case with sustainability issues. It is a multi-sector challenge. It is a multi-actor challenge because you need to engage all actors across the value chain. It's a multi-scale challenge as well because of the interscalar interdependencies, and as I think the maps I showed you illustrated well. And there's huge complexity of actor networks that are involved. So the question is also, is there capacity in cities and regions to develop, implement, and monitor circular economy strategies, which are inevitably very complex? So, implications for us here, for regional studies. A few points on that. I did a quick search through Web of Science to check where circular economy research is happening. And these are the predominant disciplines, right? Environmental sciences, environmental engineering, environmental studies, and so on. Then further down the line, we come to some spatial disciplines. Regional urban planning appears here. Please compare the numbers. 1,600 papers in environmental sciences versus 120 in regional urban planning. And then if we narrow it down to those areas that are related to regional studies, area studies, urban studies, geography, public administration, development studies, there's really not much happening in our field at the moment, which I think is a gap that we should be looking into. And I close with this list that I will not really go through of potential knowledge gaps and avenues for further research. But there's really a lot of interesting things there for us to explore, a lot of interesting implications, relationships, functional geographies of metabolic flows, cross-border waste flows, what drives actually the material consumption and waste generation, which is very differentiated across the regions, what are the regional endowments that matter for developing the circular economy, what are the land use conflicts, and so on, questions of governance, of planning, and so on. So I will end on that note, inviting you maybe to consider that as a new area for research, and I would like to plant the RSA flag in this territory by doing that. Thank you.
If I could just invite the speakers back up to the stage. I'm just going to make 3 brief points while you potentially think of some questions and comments. We've got about half an hour for those comments. So I've got 3 comments I want to make. One is slightly tongue-in-cheek, and the other two are slightly more, hopefully, substantive. The first one is, as somebody who loves alliteration, thank you to Lewis and Marcin for proving that alliteration is alive and well. On a more serious note, I want to pick out 2 short phrases that I think were absolutely integral to the presentations that maybe we can focus on. The first one was in Gillian's opening presentation, where it was hidden at the bottom of one of the first slides, where it was, in quote, "In short, nobody wins." Conversely, Lewis, when he was presenting, emphasised another 4-word little phrase, "make the future attractive." I think that probably highlights the 2 absolute extremes of what we're dealing with here. And I guess the third provocation, as a group of predominantly academics here, is The world out there is changing, okay? We can see that, we can see in the presentation, we've focused a lot on kind of turbulence and the kind of dynamics and change that's going on. And I guess the provocation might be as academics, and I think Marcin's presentation at the end left us with a really important point. As academics, we tend to be resistant to change. And I guess there's a question there about when we leave the room this afternoon, about how we evolve and think about our own practices. And I think that's probably one of the challenges that we probably reflect on. So those are just three of the kind of thoughts that I had. But we've got half an hour for questions, comments, so if anybody would like to kick off, we've got some roving mics. Gentleman there, 3 or 4 rows from the back. If you can introduce who you are and where you're from as well, please, that'd be helpful.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Marcin. I'm an economist. I work at MHCLG, so work on policy rather than economics. Thank you for those really interesting presentations, which obviously covered a wide range of areas. I suppose the thought which occurred to me, and this is addressed to all the panelists, how would you judge success? So what metrics would be important to you in terms of saying, in terms of spatial policy, this is deemed to be successful?
Thank you. If I can suggest giving the question to all 4, if we can go down the line, start with Gillian, can we say 30 seconds each to get as many questions as possible?
That's a very good question. I think sort of connecting it to the work of the UK Commission, which I talked about, it's definitely been a live debate and a clear sort of emphasis upon shifting away from traditional metrics, which certainly don't capture, I think, the inequality. I think the economic inequalities that exist across the UK, for example, are play out and are so deeply connected to wider sets of health and social and environmental inequalities that we have to capture a dashboard of metrics, I think, to see how we can address those. When you think about things like foundational economy, there are debates there around measuring livability, so taking into account living costs, I think, is a critical issue in terms of addressing properly how we understand inequalities and how they impact on people's lives. So there is a sort of a big set of issues there, but I think the multiple metrics, dashboards and indicators are key.
Okay, again, in the commission, I think one of the paper we did is actually review the measure. I mean, there's I think general consensus across, I think, internationally, especially through the UN Habitat's work, that we need to move away from the GDP fetish type of approach to things, including China. Actually, China proposed to have a new type of urbanization, actually putting the ecosystem into the center of it. So we think that it's not wrong to measure economic growth, but alongside, we need to look at well-being, look at happiness, quality of life, and those are equally important.
Big question, short answers. I would agree with the previous speakers. GDP per capita, even though we use it, is a very flawed indicator, not my preferred one. I think picking up on the beyond GDP debate, I would definitely say we need to look at distributions, not averages. You know, what happens to the bottom end of the spectrum, and I feel like we haven't done that enough. And the other thing I would look at, income is definitely not the only or even the most important indicator. For me, it would be measures of local quality of life, and I think local is where I would put the emphasis, local well-being, and maybe more importantly, increasing confidence in the future for themselves and their areas.
Right, thank you very much. So from my perspective, well, 2 points. One of them, what would be a measure of success? I think more papers with critical engagement on circular economic policies. That would be a quantifiable measure of success, I think. And more seriously, and more about circular economic policies, I think, well, there's different ways of measuring that. And obviously, you can measure the progress towards zero waste. So the amount of waste generated per capita in different waste flows. But also, there's less tangible things you could measure in terms of let's say the side benefits of moving towards circular economy. Because a lot of the solutions that, for example, we'll be looking at could have also potential to create jobs. It's also quantifiable, but improve spatial quality, for example, makes a better our cities and regions better places to live by, for example, recycling not only materials but also land, and think of how you can connect those circular processes also to land, to
redevelopment of brownfields, polluted land, and so on. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Gillian. I'm a PhD student at the LSE, and I wanted to ask a slightly provocative question to Lewis. That comes from that's only because I'm a big fan of EU regional policy. But I wanted to ask you, at a time when political discontent in the so-called left-behind places is posing an existential challenge to the European Union, why is the European Commission proposing to decrease the share of the EU budget devoted to regional policy rather than increasing it? Thank you.
Spot-on question. Answer. The real answer is actually more complicated in the sense that we've asked for a bigger budget. So actually the per capita investments we're proposing for cohesion policy go up slightly if you look at it in constant prices. So we're maintaining a constant effort of investment in all EU regions. We've increased the number of transition regions by expanding them from between 75 and 90% to 75 and 100% of EU GDP per capita. So we've increased the number of regions in that middle category that get more investment. Andres yesterday made a plea for taking into account dynamics. We haven't gone that far yet, but maybe this is something to keep in mind for the future. But I think overall, we need to demonstrate that cohesion policy is a policy that is concerned about the issues facing communities in the future. And rather than trying to address problems we've identified in the past, I think we need to do a better job of convincing them that this is not imposed upon them, but this is an opportunity that we give them to co-create their future.
Okay. Next question. Neil.
Hi, thanks. Mia Gray from Cambridge University. Can I ask both for Jill and Celia a provocative question about the 2017 report? And can I ask you to talk more about environmental challenges within that and the ways in which, every report now has kind of a increased environment as part of it, but often it's presented as costless, without a trade-off, that is just part of where we'll get to. I wonder how you're grappling with that and what sort of trade-offs we're really thinking about and how you're conceptualizing that.
I think there is work commission, is it a Hill Barton or something? I think there is work coming on stream on that because we're highly aware there is a gap in there.
I think it's probably fair to say that the initial report that the Commission put out, there wasn't enough emphasis on environment. I think when it went out for consultation, it was very clear that there was a very strong voice that needed to be rectified. And there's been much more work, and there is ongoing work, as Cecilia said, to recognise the fact to address economic inequalities and spatial inequalities, we have to see them as connected to the environmental issues that we face. And I think that's obviously it's easy to say that the devil is going to be in the detail of what that actually means, but I think just having that notion, we see one of the 7 actions or recommended actions is to secure or achieve just transitions, if that's possible. Just having that there and I think having that up front is a really important and significant development in the Commission's work really, is to say that these issues need to be addressed concurrently. We can't sort of see them as separate or environment as an add-on or an afterthought. It's got to be embedded in addressing these issues.
Yeah, I think more modelling work is commissioned, but the problem I think we face as any of this sort of thing, once you start the inquiry, you find that things is much bigger, but actually there's no resources. So a lot are in-kind contribution for academic colleagues and other people. But some of the modelling work we do need to have funding, because if you employ RA to do it, I think that is the challenge. That's why we do it in a sort of a mortgage type approach. You pay your installment a bit and then we can do more work. So that's why we don't think we're going to resolve the problem. We really hope that the Commission is actually start the debate and engage all of us that feel that we can have time to contribute. I bet it will be a long-term campaign. Maybe in the next 10 years we can get to somewhere else. I think we're very successful.
just important to address environmental issues, but I think it's also very important how we frame them. I love the just transitions framing because it really emphasizes it's not just a question of pricing carbon and the market's going to sort it out. Some people are going to need support to make that transition, and then especially the ones on a very low budget are going to struggle if we don't help them. But I also think environmental issues, we have a lot of them that we issue at the European level, urban air quality directive, making sure cars don't pollute. We put in those directives, but often they're portrayed as hindering businesses and as detrimental. But the long-term health benefits of that don't get highlighted enough. I mean, I find it difficult to understand that people are rebelling against Brussels while we're trying to make sure they have clean air. I mean, there was a recent study in the Netherlands, I don't remember the exact figures, but they estimated that the combination of the Clean Urban Air Directive and the car directives increased life expectancy something by 6 years over a period of 40 years. I mean, that is a very tangible contribution. That's why we do it together, because a country alone could never do it. And then I'll close on a polite request. I dislike what I would describe project guilt. And project guilt is the conviction that if we make people feel really, really, really guilty about doing things that contribute to carbon emissions, we'll all fix climate change. And for example, the new concept of shaming people who take airplanes is not going to help. I think we need to have a story that says we can address climate change. It's not going to ruin your life. It's not going to kill off your vacation, but it requires concerted action. But I mean, I think we need to tell an attractive, positive story about how we're going to overcome climate change rather than trying to guilt in random individual behavior and hoping that will fix it. End of my rant. Thanks.
I'm going to take a little bit of chair's privilege because in terms of the first question, in terms of success, and I think it builds on a point Lewis has just made there, is when the question of what would constitute success, the answers were very much kind of almost like metric driven in terms of an ideal kind of place we want to get to. I wonder, in relation to what you were saying about actually success is about changing attitudes, because if we can't change attitudes, we've had the data, we've got robust, rigorous data, but if we can't change people's attitudes to how they kind of see things in terms of, one of the presentations talked about governments and investment decisions and those things, if we can't change behaviours, so it's actually the success, change of behaviour or change of attitude, what do you think that would constitute? Given we're all friends at 4:30 on the last day of the conference. Where do you see change of attitudes going to? Makes it a question.
Well, attitudes can change, and sometimes surprisingly rapidly. My wife is American, so I've been going there regularly. And one thing that really totally surprised me is how rapidly they changed their mind on the acceptability of gay marriage, for example. So you can get rapid, progressive changes in opinion. You can also get, obviously, the other direction. But I think for the various challenges that we are facing, I think the storyline that we need to bring is that change is possible and change can be a force of good. And right now, I think the uncertainty about the future is causing a lot of people to retract and try and cling on what they have and fearing any change. And there are a lot of changes happening. We have a slow productivity growth. We have almost zero wage growth for many workers out there. So they're concerned about the future. Some places are losing population. The biggest investment people have made in their lives, their house is worth less in the future. I mean, we need to try and make sure that they feel less threatened and more confident that can actually act in such a way that the future is more within their control, more attractive. And I think that willingness to change and that confidence that we can do it together in a way that's going to make it a success is really what we're needing, lacking.
Can I comment on this just very quickly? I think that indeed change of attitudes is really crucial also from the perspective of the topic that I presented to you. And we also found this in the project importance of behavior behavioral change, because you need to be ready to accept, for example, to pay a premium for circular products, way more expensive if you do it that way. And this readiness for this is not really yet there, for example, when it comes to circular building materials. The builders, at least in the Netherlands, case that we looked at, are really not ready to use those products and pay more for them, and the consumers as well, perhaps neither. But at the same time, we can see some positive examples of how those perceptions of the problem can change and can shift. We have one of our cases is in the region of Łódź in Poland, where the circular economy was really not a topic, no issue when we started the project. But this has shifted tremendously in the 3 years we've been talking about this in Łódź, and sort of given an impetus for development, for example, of a city strategy for circular economy. So I think that this can really change, and it's really important. And just to give a little bit of a counterpoint to Lewis's talk about environmental policies being kind of moaned about and people not being happy about them. Just maybe as a counterpoint here, I can bring you the example from Esport Compass project. That we looked at how EU policies affect planning and territorial governance in the European countries. And environmental policies were the policy where there was the most impact on planning across Europe. It wasn't cohesion policy, only where the funding was going. But environmental policy was the single most influential European policy when it comes to territorial governance and planning in the member states. So maybe that's a positive thing happening.
My question about that is, did they like it?
No.
If they didn't like it, that's not a good success metric.
Gillian, Cecilia, in terms of the Commission and the work you're doing, obviously trying to influence certain key stakeholders, have you seen any willingness to change in terms of attitude or process?
I think there's a willingness to accept the issues and the seriousness of the issues and the size of the challenge. One of the areas which I think is critical for seeing this attitude change is in terms of devolution, where in the UK I think it's fair to say it's been quite technocratic, quite top-down, sort of a feeling that maybe the city regions and city deals, it's a sort of an elite group who know about it and know what it means. So for me, a big challenge is how to get devolution which has citizens engaged, and it connects to really Lewis's point about, what does this mean for me? And does this make a difference for my life? I get the sense in which there's a big kind of gap between what maybe devolved bodies or authorities are doing and saying, and how people feel it impacts on their everyday life. So there's an attitude change and a gap there, I think, that would be important to address.
So,
One quick one on the devolution law. I like the idea of devolution if we don't use it as a hidden way of cutting investment. Right now is, here's a lot of power and less money than we usually spend on these problems, go fix it. I mean, that's a horrible way of ensuring that devolution will fail. We're not spending enough money on it now. We're going to give you even less money, but because you're local, you can fix it. I mean, that's just a horrible deal. Now, I don't like talking about deals, and the recent politicians who talk about deals don't know what they're talking about, but that's clearly a bad deal.
So in that, I'll let Cecilia go, and then we've got 10 minutes to try and get that to be more positive.
I call them pass the buck. That is why they do that. I just talk about the commission. When we first had the idea, we said because I spent a lot of time to persuade people. I think we get really mixed reception. Some people really feel why you talk about regional inequality is a bit old hat. So it is actually there need to be a few people really persistent and believe in it and go to try to do it. And at the end of the day, policymakers, a lot of people, they're just like us. We all have different viewpoints, different perspectives. We argue like everything, especially Brexit, reflected the worst of human nature. And policymakers no different. So to me, I think is you need to find different button and different lever. Maybe you're lucky, you find one button and that one suits, and then bingo, we get it. So I just feel that I'm still trying to find those lever and button. I'm saying as all of us. And the only thing is you just need to believe in it and somehow a bit romantic about it.
Okay, do we have more questions from the audience? Yeah, the lady in the back.
Thank you. From Gillian how does this kind of mission-oriented policy play out in city and regional level, and should like government or policymakers set certain kind of missions with regard to regional development? Thank you.
We get that question a lot. I think the answer that we tend to give is that with regional policy, we try and find a balance between higher level constraints and local or regional agency. And that sounds very abstract, but if we were to give money to all regions and say, spend whatever you want with it, we would see a lot of decisions which other regions have tried and shown are a very, very bad idea. I can mention steam trains built in Hungary, I can mention double highways built in Portugal. So we're trying to find a dialogue where we take on board local knowledge, local priorities, but we're also able to share experience from other regions and EU priorities in a joint decision about how we should invest those funds. I don't think we know how they should be invested, but I do think we can share experience from other places. Given that it's our funding, I think it's also fair to say that we have a number of priorities we would like them to address. But they also need to come with their priorities, their issues, the needs of their voters, their citizens, their firms, and then we try and find a balance between those conflicting needs. With misoriented policies, I mean, you do get a situation where if you have a blanket rule for an entire union, you run risk that occasionally it will backfire. So there was a concern with the single market that this would create imbalances, and actually cohesion policy at its origin was set up to compensate potential regions that were going to lose out in the single market. But also with other one-size-fits-all kind of rules, there is a risk that it backfires, whether it's on air quality or energy efficiency. So I do think there's a need to adjust and try and accommodate a kind of like those sectoral policies with a more integrated, adapted policy. And that's what we're hoping or trying to achieve with cohesion policy. It's far from easy, but those are the ambitions.
It says that we have a bit about mission-oriented policies at local and regional level, and I think for many localities and regions, they maybe know what the challenges are. If you think of missions and challenges as the same sort of thing, and it's how to sort of address those challenges. And there's some interesting work going on in Wales in support of the foundational economy, where the Welsh Government has introduced some challenge funding, saying you can bid for some funding to develop experimental, innovative new ways to maybe embed the foundational economy in your locality. So it could be, for example, using public procurement around a hospital or another public body better to sort of support local SMEs in the area. So I think there is certainly a role for experimental governance and experimental sort of forms of policy within that local and regional level.
So I had a question about the foundational economy. I don't know much about it. I heard it on the previous RSA conference, but I'm not an economist either, but it sounds like it's the non-tradable sector, right? So the bit that can't grow because there's no additional demand coming from elsewhere, right?
Yeah, it's not tradable, but it's also a huge proportion of many local economies that perhaps don't have strong tradable export-oriented sectors. But those sectors fulfill important objectives in terms of social well-being, health and environment, and there are often untapped opportunities to build on foundational economy and enhance local supply chains, for example. So it's not saying it's the answer or the whole answer, but it's maybe part of the answer. And it does embed local economic activity a little bit more in a place and potentially have important social and environmental outcomes as well.
Just a quick reaction to your question and then your answers to that. I would just very much support what Julie said about experimentation. a lot of the problems with misguided policy stem from path dependence. Right? They get some preconceived ideas about how policies work and what works as solutions. So perhaps we need to experiment with new ideas, and there's a lot of kind of new kinds of platforms for doing that. There's policy labs, urban living labs. So we could try new things, radical things at the local scale and see if they work. If they don't, then leave them. And if they do, try to upscale them. And then the second point I wanted to make is also about, well, I think you mentioned that quite critical light is if you ask people what to spend money on, probably won't get good results. But you could again dedicate maybe a part of the budget for that, and then achieve some more place-based solutions, because probably the local people would know a bit better than national level government about what the spending priorities are and what could be the levers of change. And at the same time, you could get some more benefits in terms of delivering a more positive message, engaging the citizens, and so on.
Can I jump in? Just quickly on that point, I was trying to say if the local politician gets to decide what the money gets spent on, he will, or she will not only come up with good ideas. That was what I was trying to say. We push very much for engaging with a broader number of stakeholders to get a more deliberated decision, and then hopefully that will also lead to better quality projects. On experimentation, I think there's a lot to be experimented on. On the foundational economy, I'm staying on the fence. If some region would come to us and like, we're not going to invest in tradable sector. No, that's not for us. We're just going to invest in the local, non-tradable sector. I'm not sure I'd be able to convince a lot of people in the DG that that was a terribly good idea.
Okay, I think that's probably a good point at which to stop. No one to stop the ongoing dialogue. It's never a right point to stop one of these conversations, but I do want to just say thank you very much to all four of you for being willing participants